So I've been hearing about the sovereign citizen defense for a long time. I've actually got exposed to this quite a few years ago, and have books sitting on my shelf, and I've had people tell me about this, and recently saw this come across my X feed, and I thought this might be a good place to open the discussion. Lucas, have you seen this video? Should we start with this?
I have seen this video, and I think this is a great start to a discussion about sovereign citizenship. I have also been aware of the movement ever since that I was a child. Uh, which is a different story. But yeah, let's start with the video. And if people aren't familiar with this, this is what some people proffer as a defense for various things. And there's some interesting germs to where this idea comes from. So we wanted to dig into that today.
Criminal, right?
Yeah, but under common law, or is it military and tribunal? Because also with
I've been waiting for something like this for so long. This is so much fun. You have to have a Texas driver license. You also have to have liability insurance as a minimum. Those are the two main requirements that you need to drive. If you're going to drive a vehicle, it also has to be registered. So if you don't have that, you can't drive.
I wasn't making commerce. I used to do medical transportation, so I'm kind of aware with licensing and registration and everything.
It doesn't matter whether you're saying you're conveying, whether you're traveling, you have the right to walk.
I have the right to travel, don't I?
Yeah, taking your happy-go-lucky feet. You want to travel, take those 2 feet to travel, not in a car.
Just what the 14th Amendment was saying, like I have the right to travel.
You do, yes, and you can walk your happy ass from one part to the other part. Not in a car though, not without a license and insurance. If you do, if you get your driver's license and show me that you have.
I'm not a commercial driver. I don't engage in commerce. I don't.
Whether you were conveying, whether you were in commerce, non-commerce, injuries don't care whether you're conveying, whether you're traveling. When you get into an accident, it doesn't matter in what method you're doing it. An accident is just that. And if you have an accident, I want to make sure that the other party will be taken care of. I'm only asking you to follow the law. I'm not asking you to split the atom here. Great.
Break the law or any of that, but
great. I'm asking you to sign this. If you don't have to, but I'm going to revoke your bond. That's it.
Trying to apply that, I need to get a license and insurance. When I used to be a commercial driver for this day, I don't commercial drive anymore. I don't do medical transportation.
I'm having you sign a document that you understand and that you promise that you're not going to do it.
I don't understand it fully, but that's why.
If you don't, that's okay, but I am going to revoke your bond. And that's it.
Being forced to sign this right now, or it's like, because
you don't have to sign it. You know the consequence.
All right. So here's a guy in court, and he's alluding to the sovereign citizen defense. He's invoking the amendments. He's talking about the fact that has the right to travel. This is all the stuff that comes up commonly under what's known as the sovereign citizen defense. And this guy that posted this on X, this video, is referring to this, right?
Yeah, and this is pretty benign. It's a traffic violation. He's arguing as to whether he needs to present a license. I see people claiming sovereign citizenship who don't want to give ID, who talk about. I see various threads of understanding of law, of history that lead into it.
Yeah, and it comes up with respect to taxes too. It's like, oh, I'm not this paper person that was created by the U.S. corporation, and a whole bunch of stuff like that too comes up under this general bucket too, right?
Yes, and that's also another interesting one. That there some people claim, even like capitalization of names has something to do with it. On birth records. And while I do find using all caps offensive, especially on Twitter, nobody should be using all caps. That if you're unaware, that means you're yelling, and at the very least, it's very hard to read. So, however, I don't know that makes any distinction. There's a couple of things here that are really maybe fundamental to get into with all of that too. He mentions common law, and I think it's important to begin with maybe an understanding that there's of the difference between legislation and law. I believe it was Hayek who came up with that distinction. I'm rather partial to it, but we can write things down, but that's legislation. Law is actually practiced, and whether that's criminal or civil or what have you. When you make an agreement with somebody, the agreement is not what you write down between you. It's it's the understanding that exists between two people, and it's not a document. And that is also true with regards to governments, which are groups of people that maybe in our democratic republics get together and record some of that down in a legislative process as legislation. But in reality, there exists agreements in society, and violating those, we have a judicial process and that gets activated. And again, that might be criminal, that might be civil, but some of these arguments about people being sovereign. Sovereignty is something that we give to each other, and especially in our democratic republics, we granted sovereignty to the states, and that's it's also partially confused by a fight over jurisdiction between our federal government and our state governments. So there are some reasons why people get confused over this issue, and it sort of saddens me to see somebody coming in a court of law and I understand the frustration of the judge, but I do wish we had a system in which the citizens of the republics were better educated on the process.
And on the process, you mean of just like how all this stuff works? Like, because what you're recapping is there are legislatures and they write laws, and then those laws are in effect once they've been signed by the governor or the president or whatever. But then they get moved out into the court system, and this is then where these laws are put to the test, and it's the judiciary that begins to introspect on these laws and say, well, is it consistent with the state constitution? Is it consistent with the the Constitution of these United States? And then it can either be upheld or struck down, and all of these processes go on until we have established case law, and then that entire process plays out where precedents are set, and then even those precedents over time can be overturned and say, well, someone was in error, they didn't do this correctly, whatever. Appellate courts and Supreme Courts oftentimes look at things that have been decided in the past and say, there was some mistake that was made here, this shouldn't have been the correct law. So is that the education you're talking about? It's just like how all this sort of swims through the system and how it's intended to work?
Yes, well, partially. I like to think of it more so as legislators get together and write legislation, or they write rules down. But whenever we empower, through republics, when we empower citizens, we have moved away from the notion that one person, one king, one God decides what is right or wrong. So we have an adversarial system. This is where courts come in. And yes, we can look at further minutia, but we know that no situation is ever completely identical to one that has come before. And there are always multiple threads of understanding, multiple narratives that go into a ripping of the social fabric, and some notion that somebody has been wronged. So we go to a place of neutrality. We call that a court. We have in our adversarial system, we have this notion that there are going to be three different viewpoints. There's going to be a plaintiff, a defendant, and there is going to be an arbiter of the rules, a judge that all come together in a neutral place and have a discussion about what happened, and then there is going to be a interpretation of that legislation to determine, how this all works out. And so I think,
and as we've discussed in the past, there's sort of a couple different ways that this can go, right? The jury can say we're applying the rules or the law as it was written, and we're going to render a finding or a verdict based on what was the application of the rules. Or there's an alternative that the jury has, which is to say this law is not going to be enforced. We're just going to let this guy go free, or we're going to not apply the law because we've decided that this isn't relevant.
and very seldom even do we come before juries, but when people talk about democratic republics, I like to think that the greatest expression of democracy and the greatest expression of a citizen's power is to be impaneled in a jury and to be the decider as to what are the matters of fact, and what and whether or not legislation is appropriate, if it meets the understanding of the peers as to this is how things actually are.
Well, and that's, I think, mostly because people get railroaded by the district attorneys, where they're just like, well, you don't have the money to defend yourself and you can't do anything, and so you should just plea out. And that's, why I think it plays out that way in a lot of instances.
And I think, this is maybe speaks to a frustration that the sovereign citizen movement is pinning, is this notion of how do we find maybe a judicial or both a judicial and legislative system that are becoming classified. But there was once upon a time that we had much more. Many more decisions were decided by juries, and juries were much more empowered to understand nullification. And there are even Supreme Court justices who have said, I believe it was John Marshall who said that juries could decide matters of fact, but they didn't get to decide matters of legislation. I disagree with that. I think Thomas Jefferson would have disagreed with that too. He talked a lot about nullification. But either way, after the Civil War, with problems of jury selection and the unfairness in jury selection, we moved to a greater reliance on the giving the decision of which cases to prosecute to prosecutors, and also in giving judges a much greater power in deciding what the law was, what legislation meant, and how that was all to play out. But let's there were other things that he talked about that I find, you mentioned corporation, and I think the sovereign citizen movement also often invokes the incorporation of the federal government as a defense, and understandings about what occurred there. Are you familiar with that?
I've definitely heard about it, and I think I've even seen some things that say that Trump dissolved the corporation, or some things like this. That there was a corporation that was formed called United States, and that was sometime around the Civil War, right? So that's the best knowledge that I've got about it. I don't know a ton about it.
Well, I mentioned earlier that the states are granted sovereignty, and that is, they don't have total sovereignty. They don't have sovereignty over commerce, which this man kept bringing up commerce. He kept going back to these ideas of commerce. So there, I think it's important to think about the different powers that are split between our levels of government, and how the federal government was given the jurisdiction of commerce, but the states held onto the jurisdiction over land and property and of the citizens of the states, and how the Constitution was a document that was guaranteeing for some people the ability to move from state to state. And so I think it is there that we have such great confusion that comes out of this. Now, we do have a district that is not a state, and that happens to be the District of Columbia, where the federal government resides, or where it conducts most of its business. Are you familiar with where that comes from?
Well, I know that this was like a big fight during some early days of the Constitution, where we had whatever amount of states, but then they wanted this neutral spot that wasn't a state, where the capital was going to be, because I think it was originally in Virginia, and then they said, well, this is kind of inappropriate for it to be in one state, so to make a neutral area, they were going to make this District of Columbia, which wasn't going to be a state and would have a different sort of a thing. But then there were people living there, so then what was their relationship to the Union, right? So I think it all kind of revolves around that, in my recollection.
Yeah, well, it was in Philadelphia. The original seat of the federal government was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Oh, wait a minute. I thought they moved it to Virginia for a while. Did I misremember that, or was it in Virginia for a little while?
Well, I mean, the DC is carved out of Maryland and Virginia in land that was given on the borders of Maryland and Virginia, and it was after a mutiny. So the there was I forget what the dispute was over, but a bunch of
Wasn't there at one point where they were toying with the idea of having it be in New York? Because I think
Well, I would imagine so. And New York is New York is also very interesting, because New York is New York City was originally a corporation, and it's part of the ideas behind New York City that lead to the formation later on of the corporation to give Congress power over how it's going to run the District of Columbia. But no, there was a mutiny in Pennsylvania in 1783. Up until then, the federal government had been operating in Philadelphia, and some soldiers, I believe, were upset about pay or taxes. I forget what the details are, but the governor of Pennsylvania, John Dickinson, agreed with the soldiers and didn't agree with the federal government, so he didn't do anything about it. And it was at that point that the federal government realized that if the federal government was going to be conducting business in any one state, then they could be, held prisoner or vulnerable to their safety was dependent on the kindness, the goodwill of especially the governor of that state. And so what they did was go, to the border between Maryland and Virginia, and in land donated by Maryland and Virginia, create a special district. And that district was put under the direct authority of Congress. And in that district for some time, there were 3 different towns, and those towns had charters. And going back to this notion that if we're not going to have a king, one person in which we all turn to ask what the rules are, then we're going to put it into a document. And so the documents that ruled those towns were called charters. And later on, as the population, so especially after the Civil War, the population of the District of Columbia exploded, and because the unincorporated lands outside the charters of those cities were filling up with people, Congress got together and got rid of the charters of those towns, and instead created incorporated the rules that were going to be extended over the land, people, and property that were in the District of Columbia, and that was the District of Columbia Organic Act of 1871. Is that making more sense?
Yep. This is awesome. I'm really starting to better have a handle on it. So this is great. Yeah.
And so you can begin to understand how, coming there was a lot of change coming out of the Civil War. There can be questions as to even this notion of incorporation. When we talk about incorporation, we're talking about incorporating into the tax code the ability to tax, especially land and property that the states have. So it had been previously. I don't know if I don't know if any corporations existed previous to this, but we're also going to see more uh, uh, more large corporations come in as we see railroads coming in the 1870s and stretching out west. So, um, but this is also at a point in which we begin to see, the federal management of lands. I don't know if you've ever paid attention, but whenever we talk about the federal agencies that administer lands and resources, especially in the West, it's the Bureau of Land Management, and the national parks don't actually own the land. They pay pelt money, which is payment in lieu of taxes, because they can't own the land if the original idea of the states was that the states were going to hold power over the citizens and the land and the property. So fast forward a couple of years, when people begin to forget that, you see this notion of sovereign citizens who are grasping back at history and seeing, here is a piece of legislation in the history of the United States. There's a corporation that is given the ability to control people in a certain district. What does this mean about sovereignty? So I understand like their desire for freedom, for liberty, but the truth is that we've got to get along with our neighbors, and we originally gave states the sovereignty over bodies. So, and you can also see this. I don't know if you pay attention today, but whenever we see, especially some sort of heinous murder, you will often see charges that are brought by the state, and the state's going to charge for murder. But you see the federal government, when it charges for murder, has to charge for conspiracy to commit murder. Have you ever noticed that?
Yeah, because it's the states that can charge somebody with that, because it's the actual individuals actually reside in the states.
Yes, and the states own our body. And if you look into the arguments as that a state makes whenever there is a murder that
that's actually something I'd like you to clarify, because I know in our conversations that we've talked about this, but can you maybe say just a little bit more about that? Because you made a profound statement there that the states own our bodies. Like, is that established case law, or like how exactly does that work? Because a lot of people, I think, would find that to be a pretty eye-popping and like shocking statement, and we blew past it pretty fast. But can you maybe say a bit more about that? Because that's not something that like I think about on a daily basis. I know you've told me about it, but like it doesn't seem to resonate. Like, what does that mean? The states own our bodies.
Well, so you can see it. You can see it in a couple of ways. Now, one, there's this notion called the writ of habeas corpus, and that is talking about whose authority like must produce a body whenever there is a crime that is charged, and the executive is given, I believe, in the Constitution, the can repeal the writ of habeas corpus whenever we are in a war, and that later gets changed to at any point during the Force Acts, which come right around 1871. But we talked once about Ex parte Merriman, which was whenever Abraham Lincoln repealed the writ of habeas corpus and threw people in jail, and did not give them a trial because he's sort of dispensed. he claimed ownership of their bodies and said, well, I can just imprison them. So states are actually given this writ of habeas corpus. And again, like going to also original notions of the states, they have their own constitutions, and we originally the Constitution of the United States was about commerce. So when you begin to think also about or look into what a prosecutor is going to be talking about in a murder trial, they talk about how the state is out of a worker. And so this also is interesting in arguments that are made by sovereign citizens about notions of enslavement or commerce. Like, I'm not participating in commerce. I'm seeking freedom, etc. But if people are working together, there becomes a question, or living together, there becomes a question of what are the inputs of these people who are in a jurisdiction. So I don't know if that is bringing clarity to it, but
subject to a jurisdiction seems like a distinction between like owning our bodies. So like maybe that's a more glib way of putting it, or else saying like you're subject to the jurisdiction of the state that you live in.
Well, I would say it's even more particular, and it's the counties that are ultimately empowered. You also see this, that sovereign citizens talk about counties and county sheriffs, and they are in some small part right. It's because I mean, once upon a time in America, and probably still to some degree, if you broke the laws in a town and they were tired of somebody, they, instead of doing what we do now, just throw so many people in jail and prison them, they were often taken to the edge of town and said, "Don't come back," or assessed a fine that the town or the county judge knew that they couldn't pay, and said, "If you come back and you can't pay this fine, then we'll throw you in jail." And that was called redlining, which then gets co-opted into a concept or used by housing authorities, and is like the same practice of trying to select who's going to be living in an area. But the states certainly have control over our bodies, and I find that this is also interesting in our understanding of abortion rights in the United States today.
That's exactly where my mind was starting to go as we were, exploring this idea and talking about it more. This idea that, we're subject to the jurisdiction of the state, that the state owns our body. There's this idea that you have body autonomy, but like you're sort of casting that aside, like especially with these things like habeas corpus and the suspension of habeas corpus under the Merriman and all the rest of this stuff. So this maybe really does start to clarify a lot of this stuff, or even how the states are having the power to do some of the things they've been doing over the last 5 years.
Well, if you think about it too, the states also have a duty to protect the bodies that exist inside the state. And a couple of months ago, in a town near where I live, there was a murder, and there was a group of people who claimed sovereign citizenship who murdered two moms. And we live in a very small town. Those two ladies were related to many people around here, and whenever the people who were accused of the crime were taken into custody, and they were taken into town, the state and the sheriff's department had snipers on many of the roofs around the downtown of the town that the jail existed in. And they did so because, it's one thing to declare sovereign citizenship for yourself, but who then protects you? And the state does not accept this notion of sovereign citizenship. But you'll notice that they didn't allow the lynching of people who had committed a heinous crime. They also understood a duty to protect those people. And you can think about this in terms of abortion too, and begin to see why we have such an argument as to when does the state's duty to protect a citizen begin? And
well, and that kind of is the fight, right? That's what's being discussed here, is that some people are saying that the state's duty to protect a citizen begins well before what other people would consider, and that's this the citizenship starts at birth. That's kind of the argument, right?
well, and if the state owns, if we don't own our own bodies and we have to, they are subject to the control of the state, then you can see you can see some of yes, this is why it's a fraught discussion. And well, I don't I don't know where to go with the discussion of abortion, but going back to sovereign
Yeah,
citizenship.
I don't know that we never necessarily need to go there, but it's interesting because definitely it's coming up, and we're thinking about it as we hear these terms, or we hear it couched in these particular terms, that it definitely brings to mind things that are on the minds of a lot of people, and I would say on a lot of the minds of people who are voting this year. This is a hot button topic because this recently got called into question with the decision of the Supreme Court. But yeah, let's go back to sovereignty and like who's really sovereign. So I think the
Well,
argument here is that the states are the ones that are sovereign and not the citizens, right?
absolutely. And but maybe even to continue down a little bit with the discussion of abortion, we also bring so much of religion into this discussion, and we've talked quite often about how the First Amendment was originally originally understood as forbidding the federal government from limiting religion in the citizens, and how many of the original colonies in their charter had requirements for conscription into whatever religion that was selected by the state. So this also is I don't know. It's religion is a foundation of politics, because we have to have a discussion about how we get along with others, like into the most intimate notions of our bodies, of our minds.
Well, I think that it's really important to understand that you really are, like, you're a part of the state that you reside in, and that is something that I think gets lost in our common understanding, or our modern understanding of what place we live in. Like there was a strong identity with states, and the loose confederation of states was how this republic was formulated. And people would say, I'm from New York, or I'm from Delaware, or whatever, but like they didn't really say, I'm from these United States. Like that's a later idea that people have started to have. But you start to see the strong distinctions between each of the various states even now, like with the way that some states have legalized marijuana, or they've allowed for certain types of abortion rights, or whatever. Like there's a lot of variance in the states, and I think what's happening at the federal level is really a return to this. The states have the ability to call the shots, because they're like little independent countries, at least, and they were supposed to be. So that it was supposed to be more like France and Germany than it is like what it is, people understanding that they're part of this amalgamated whole.
And think about the problems that Bobby Kennedy is having um, with getting on the ballot in the state of New York. We've heard him talk about how he has residences in New York, in Massachusetts, and in California. And whenever it came down to filling out where he wasn't actually a citizen of, it was actually problematic, because there were different requirements for getting on the ballot in different states, and he had to consult a lawyer to decide which was the best. And how even with an awareness and advice as to what was the best practice in making that declaration, he was still removed from the ballot in the state of New York, because he was living most of the time in California, and so this is, yes, it's still an issue. And we also, part of it also gets so very confused in the wake of the Civil War, and there was,
Which, the more that I learn about it, this is where all the confusion of everything that's happened in this country really stems back to. And I hope I'm not overblowing it, but like, man, and more I look into what happened with the Civil War, it just seems like it just changed the entire tone and nature of this country.
well, I think going about to go back to like our earlier discussion of legislation and law, that it actually goes back to the writing of the Constitution. I think there were ideas that were written into the Constitution that um, w- were very different to the practice of the day, and that took a while to be understood. Um, but yes, it all came to a head in the Civil War, and there was, again, I think that we best understand the Constitution when we understand it as an agreement between states for the movement of the citizens between them. But look at some of the legislation that we have that is created in the wake of the Civil War. Apart from understanding the necessity of having control, or more control over the bodies that reside in the District of Columbia, and the creation of a corporation to control them and the property there, we have things like the Force Acts. We have the 14th Amendment that gives citizenship, and gives citizenship not only to the state in which we reside, but also to the federal government.
And
And
the
that,
14th Amendment is the one that was being discussed by the individual that was appearing in court here, right? I mean, that's specifically what he was invoking.
and I'm not sure what he was invoking about the 14th Amendment, but there are, to give citizenship or to grant citizenship is not necessarily to take from the states the jurisdiction over bodies, the writ of habeas corpus. And in the Force Acts, the authority to repeal the writ of habeas corpus from the states, and we see writ. Think about writing something down, and also our word right, R-I-G-H-T or W-R-I-T-E. It's one part that writes, or one question we should have when we see a word right is, who is enforcing that right? And some people talk about inalienable rights and God, and sometimes we just drop that off, but there's always an assumption that there's somebody enforcing a right. And that's where part, especially the Bill of Rights that are appended to the Constitution, become problematic, because if the Constitution was voluntarily entered by sovereign states, nobody. I guess the tension that existed in the Constitution that causes confusion and problems to this day is who enforces those rights. And Federalists would have said the federal government has a duty to enforce those rights, but if they're given jurisdiction only over commerce and naturalization, or immigration, you can see why these issues continue to pop up over and over and over in the ensuing history of the United States. So, but the 14th Amendment does grant citizenship to not only the United to the several states, but also, and when I say several, by the way, I often use the word several. Are you familiar with we often say several to mean many, but
Yeah, this means separate. Like I usually use it as the legal meaning as well. It means in separate, or like that would be the more common way that we would understand several.
yeah, think of its association to severed.
Yeah, like that's what happens when your head gets chopped off. You've been severed.
Yes, your body is several. When your head gets chopped off, your body has become several. But the states were considered several, and they had autonomy. They They had their own Congresses. They were republics. This is also when we get into Article 4 of the Constitution, and I find Article 4 to be fascinating because of these inherent ironies that exist in the Constitution. That it is both an agreement about the sovereignty of the state, but then it presumes to tell them what to do. We can begin to ask ourselves, well, who is making the rules here? Who's telling who what to do?
And I think part of the understanding was that there was some amount of ceding of the sovereignty of the states to create this overarching federal government. And this is this whole federalist versus anti-federalist sort of tension that existed when this thing was first being written, and it harkens back to the Articles of Confederation, right, where this was the much looser document, much less teeth in it. And so this idea that we would have this constitution was one of the first pushbacks, right? I mean, they were like, what is this? I thought you guys were just going to revise this thing we already had, but now you've come up with this monstrosity that creates the federal government, and this thing is not what anybody wanted.
It's very true. And the Articles of Confederation, we also heard, well, I don't know if it was in the video, but some of the sovereign citizenship talks about admiral law. I believe it's admiral law, but some of this also goes back to the Articles of Confederation, notions of if there's a place that nobody lives in, who creates the law there? What do we do with territories that have not been declared states yet? And how does a government form in that area? There's also, so even in the 14th Amendment, one thing that I often think about is another interesting juncture of all of these ideas, and that is native lands and native rights too, because part of the presumption of some of these documents that we see is that there is an uncontested history of title, and that's not true. And when the 14th Amendment gives citizenship to the formerly enslaved people of the states, it notably excluded native peoples. And when we talk about, again, when we talk about federal government control of resources, we talk about the Bureau of Land Management, etc., national parks, national monuments. We're always avoiding the invocation of the word land. And part of the reason is because it was a sticky thing to remember that the federal government had been engaged in fighting wars over or buying land from native peoples and establishing treaties with them, and had given them sovereignty from the state in which they resided. And that would later change in later legislation like the Dawes Act. But we didn't always necessarily have rules, the same set of rules for everybody that existed in the lands that would become the United States. So we're sort of at 40 minutes. I don't. There was more that I wanted to talk about with this. It's amazing how quickly the time has flown by. But I think maybe we've made a little bit of brought a little elucidation as to where this movement comes from.
Well, maybe we should do a part 2. Maybe tomorrow we can pick this up, because I think this is a fascinating subject. It comes up all the time. If you see what's going on with the sovereign citizen defense, I think every time it sounds good, and I think the reason that it resonates with people is because the people of the United States, they want freedom, they want the kinds of liberty that they feel like they're being denied, and I think this idea that there's a sovereign citizen defense, or that there's something that's being kept from them, it resonates, because I think we're all feeling an oppressive hand of government sort of pushing down on us, and this desire to be free is somewhat inherent in the human condition. And so I think if you've got more to say that we haven't covered, that we should do a part 2. Let's pick it up tomorrow and see where else we can go with this, because I think there maybe is a bit more to unpack here. And I don't fault anybody for looking into this stuff and having the desire for freedom and the desire to, you know, be a sovereign citizen. Because I think right now there's a lot of things that feel pretty oppressive in this world.
I would love to continue to talk about it. I'll just maybe end it with both. I think these ideas are infectious and have caught on throughout the world, and we see a focus on the United States. I believe not because the dollar that we have sent throughout the world, and not because our military, but the ideas that underpin the United States. And I think that the jury is. I think both the justice system is the branch of government that we talk about, that we understand the least, that we talk about the least, we understand the least. And I think that that is where our powers of sovereignty, or our powers to decide the what the voice of the peers are, is the strongest. So we'll pick it up there tomorrow then.
All right, sounds great. We'll see you tomorrow.